Okay, well, thank you so much to the Phi Beta Kappa chapter of Hamlin, and particularly Professors Kodu and Bertson, and also to Mariah and Olivia for hosting me. And thanks also to the students who came out tonight, and also some community members. I really appreciate you being here. So I've conducted aspects of various aspects of human-environment relations on the Tibetan Plateau for since the 1990s. And in 2004, I encountered for the first time within the People's Republic of China, PRC, Tibetan environmentalists who identified themselves as such, Tibetans who were talking about the environment as something that they cared about and were acting in relationship to. And soon I came to learn that there was actually, at this moment in time, this real sort of flourishing of Tibetans organizing grassroots environmental protection activities, writing about the relationship between Tibetan culture and nature, and again, identifying as environmentalists. And this led me to try to understand both their activities, which I'll share with you, their motivations, their understandings of nature, and also what it was about that particular moment in time that allowed this to happen. So as part of the research I did, I made an educational film, which I'm going to show you in a moment. The film is really a starting point for the conversation. And so I'm going to just set the scene just a little bit more, show the film, and then turn back to this question about what it was about that moment. Then I will sort of open it up and provide a more complex picture of contemporary Tibetan articulations of nature by examining a range of different approaches. And then I'll conclude by discussing the more recent situation of environmental action in Tibet. I'll add that I know there's a really strong interest in climate change here at Hamlin. So in the Q&A period, if you want to ask me questions that aren't related to this, if you want to ask about climate change, I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. So one way to sort of set the scene is with what transnational NGOs were doing in the early 2000s. So in 2002, representatives of the world's three largest NGOs, environmental NGOs, that is the Nature Conservancy, WWF, and Conservation International, as well as more than 80 Chinese and foreign experts, gathered in China to define a new conservation hotspot, or a biodiversity hotspot, called the Mountains of Southwest China. Importantly, this new ecoregion overlapped by about 80% with Tibetan areas, including in the Tibet Autonomous Region and what's now been divided into Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan provinces. Following soon after this, a number of transnational conservation efforts were initiated for the hotspot. So in Northwest Yunnan, for example, which is shown here, this project, there was a large project which had a significant component dedicated to indigenous culture, addressing, among other things, Tibetan concerns about preventing climbing on their sacred mountain. They also started to work with Chinese and foreign ethnobotanists who demonstrated that Tibetan sacred areas were sites with higher levels of biodiversity than areas that were not protected in this way. Similarly, CI established this Sacred Lands Project with efforts to mobilize Tibetan religious leaders to promote environmental education and biodiversity conservation. One of their key goals was, as the brochure said at that time, to help Tibetan communities observe their already existing Buddhist traditions, according to which, quote, they aspire to live in harmony with the land, treating certain mountains, forests, and rivers as sacred sites. So one among the many people who sort of connected with this call to protect the environment through traditional culture was this man named Rinchen Somdrup, who is photographed here in his home village in Chamdo. And he's one of the two main protagonists of the film, which I'm going to try now to show you. Okay, so I'm sure you have lots of questions, and I want to give you time to ask them, but I have a talk that goes with this. Okay, so first let me give you a little bit more of a temporal dimension of Rinchen Somdrup's environmentalism, which is not really covered in the film. So shown on the left here is an essay that he wrote in 1997, which describes in great detail the location and historical and religious importance of his home valleys, sacred mountains, the flora and fauna, and quotes long passages from Buddhist texts. Much of the essay is devoted to an explanation of the negative consequences of harming the place. So just a little quote. Destroying mountains, defiling springs, disturbing the Nian, logging the forests, killing animals will cause suffering from a variety of strange diseases, such as scars, acute pains, the death of livestock, and so forth. All of these destructive things are happening. Nobody can ignore them, and they show very clearly the need to focus, the need for protection in the present in relationship to the virtuous rules of the past. So the essay gives rationales for environmental protection that are very specific to the beings that inhabit the locality, rather than those based on principles of kind of ecological interconnectedness. It does not self-consciously use the terms nature, culture, or even environmental protection. This serves as an interesting contrast to another essay he wrote in 2003, which stresses the need to protect the natural environment for the good of all humanity. This latter essay reads in part, quote, "One aspect of the environment depends on the other. They're all interconnected. Our ancestors long ago decoded the secret of interdependency of various aspects of the environment. We should pay attention to these rich traditions. They have much in common with modern science. If promoted, these traditions might be helpful for researchers in their search for understanding nature." So building on ideas expressed earlier in a localized and specific vocabulary, this latter essay re-articulates them in ways that are self-consciously environmental and scientific. In making such statements, he and others articulate new environmental subjectivities. That is, they become people for whom the environment is a conceptual category that organizes thought and practice. So in thinking about, why I found this interesting and why this moment was new and worthy of analysis, it's important to remember that even though, here in our particular time and space, the idea is that indigenous peoples are stewards of the earth is not particularly new. At that time, the enthusiastic and repeated articulation by both Chinese and Tibetans living in the PRC that Tibetans might possess ecological knowledge, and moreover, that Tibetan culture might have something to offer mainstream Chinese society was really novel and striking, right? Given long-standing histories of Chinese imaginations of Tibetans only as backwards and barbaric, and more importantly, given ongoing restrictions imposed by the Chinese party state about its territorial sovereignty, so that any form of religious practice or authority deemed anti-science or superstitious was quite suspect. And part of what was important about these familiar sounding claims was the fact that they became thinkable in this context, where they were not before. And arguably, again, today, with a new wave of repression, they are much less common than they were at this particular point in time. But as a result of, during this moment, there were lots of trips between Beijing-based environmentalists who, for example, went to visit and worked with them to help them gain funding and national recognition and visibility. So just a little bit about the circumstances that came together for this idea to gain traction and to gain a national audience. So one, I've already mentioned that there was at that time transnational conservation interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And I'd say today those big INGOs have sort of moved on to more neoliberal market approaches and aren't so interested anymore. Another important circumstance was changing Chinese representations of Tibetans. From this idea of just backwards barbaricness, in the 80s, there started to be new images that appeared. They were romanticized, they were essentialized, and yet they started to, even with those problems, they started to create some sort of opening for interest. The Chinese state also promoted tourism to stimulate the economy, and that brought people into closer contact with Tibetans, mostly mass tourism that doesn't do much, but some sort of more, long-term engagement. And, China's sort of repression of religion and its industrialization at that moment was also causing a lot of Chinese to seek some sort of spirituality, to seek for meaning. And so many Chinese, wealthy Chinese also became quite interested in Tibetan Buddhism. I also want to pause for a second to talk about the role that Zhado, the other main protagonist, played in the film. So the program that Conservation International China had for its Sacred Lands program, if you look at the language, it's actually quite similar to what he was doing with his own NGO. And that was not accidental because, in fact, they learned from him through their collaborations with him. And in fact, the success of many of the activities they proposed were through input from him, and they're dependent on, they were only successful because there were lamas and rinpoches who were willing and eager to take up this message of conservation. This in turn was because there was already a circulation of ideas about Tibetan Buddhism and the environment that were circulating in other epistemic networks, centering around Serta, where Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, a very well-known teacher, had a Buddhist academy, a sort of sort of all schools of Buddhism, Buddhist academy. So he himself had traveled to India and the West in the 1990s. He came into contact with ideas about Buddhism and the environment. After he returned to Tibet, his institute became a major center for learning and teaching, and the origins of contemporary Buddhist modernist movements, including of vegetarianism, of having pastoralists take oaths not to sell their livestock to markets, and of not wearing pelts of endangered animals, among others. So those of you who are Tibetans will know that in 2006, the Dalai Lama made a statement about not wearing pelts, and there were a lot of burnings. But actually, this festival where they were doing the same thing happened before that. It happened in 2005. So my point is as follows. I think many scholars have argued that the uptake of Tibetan culture by transnational conservation organizations is a romanticization of Tibetan culture. It's a misunderstanding of their beliefs, and that it further marginalizes them. And I think this is a danger to be aware of. I mean, certainly I think many, we're aware now in the US of the danger of speaking for others, particularly indigenous others, and that's something to be wary of. But at the same time, these critiques, at least in the Tibetan case, might fail to recognize the Tibetan agency in the forging of these complicated and contingent collaborations in the first place. Right. And so Conservation International's program itself can be traced not only to Western or Chinese conservationists, but also to an epistemic community of Tibetan Buddhist leaders that had been created over time through circulation of knowledge, ideas, and people. Okay, so you saw in the film a couple of different organizations. There are a bunch of others as well, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a number of other grassroots Tibetan organizations focused on the environment. So this group was in Northwest Yunnan province. One of the association members in 2003 met someone from CI China who's like looking for money to disperse, basically. And they decided together to do some work to reduce the overharvesting of incense cypress, because there was this big influx of tourists coming in to see the famous and circumambulate the famous sacred mountain Kawakarbo, which is shown there. This year where this happened was particularly timely because there's a 60-year cycle of circumambulations, and that was going to be like the biggest year, bringing in about 500,000 pilgrims and other tourists. And so their proposal was to reduce the sale of cypress for incense and regularize the market. And they invited, again, a number of respected Rinpoches to incorporate messages about this into their religious teachings. So the project drew attention from larger conservation organizations. It was deemed very successful, and it reduced income cedar harvesting by about 10% of its earlier levels. In addition to this project, the organization also worked with local village community groups to protect wild animals by dismantling traps, encouraging the reduction of consumption of packaged goods, and they worked with TNC to map sacred mountains. So as one funder wrote at the time, quote, "Their view of the environment has a direct resonance with modern ecologists." Yet in my conversations with him, I'll call him Lobsang, spanning 4 years, he argued vigorously on the one hand that a focus on reviving and maintaining Tibetan Buddhist practices is the most effective way to achieve the conservation goals espoused by Western and Chinese conservationists. At the same time, he offered a number of strong critiques of mainstream conservation practice. Indeed, despite his own active participation in environmental protection, Lobsang once called environmentalists arrogant for believing that they had the power to protect the environment. The mistake, he said, derives from a confusion of causes and effects. He said, ultimately, the state of the environment with respect to a particular being depends upon his or her sonam, or fortune. That in turn derives from their accumulated karma, or leh. And this in turn is the product of one's mind, or sim. The state of the environment is the result, and the activities of one's minds are the ultimate cause. Now, his particular articulation stands in contrast to other works that have stressed, for example, Buddhist concepts of no self, no harm, independent co-origination. And so, there's not one kind of view among Tibetan Buddhists. But for him, he said, environmentalists are like people trying to change apple trees into orange trees by grafting oranges onto apple branches, right? He says, what's needed for an orange tree to plant is to plant an orange seed. Only by working on the ultimate cause of environmental destruction can one change it as an effect. However, this view based on karma does not, as some people have argued, lead to a propensity for inaction. At the same time that the environment is ultimately the fruit of past karma, both individual and collective, actions towards the environment are also simultaneously always laying down new conditions. And so the idea of fortune constitutes an economy an economy of fortune, one that refers not only to the past, but also to the future of consequences that a non-virtuous action may bring in this or the next life. In addition, Lobsang and others like him were very critical of Western methods that focus on surveillance and on participation in monitoring activities. Environmental scholar Arun Agarwal has argued that it's the acts of participation in resource management and monitoring activities, such as found in community-based forestry, that leads to the production of environmental identities. In contrast, Lobsang and others are deeply skeptical of the effectiveness of surveillance, which for him cannot produce environmentalism. He says laws and monitoring only work when someone is looking. In contrast, he said, quote, if we work on our culture, then our minds are protected and no one will want to hunt or log. Environmental protection is narrow. Traditional culture is wide in comparison. When there are no people around to surveil, traditional culture is more useful. Okay, that's one example. Another example is this well-known group called Nimbo Yuzi, which also the slide that I started the presentation with. So unlike Lobsang, the founder of this organization is a Kempo, a learned monk in the Nyingma tradition, who's firm in his conviction that he should work in the world outside of the monastery. So he and his friend began to undertake various environmental projects in 2007. And currently their organization has been involved in resolving conflicts over between pastoralists and snow leopards, river and lake cleanup, trying to monitor wetlands, lakes, grasslands, vegetations, and birds, documenting plants and animals, environmental education, patrolling against outside hunters, and community filmmaking. They also direct a lot of energy to traditional culture, including cataloging stories of Shida, or territorial deities, which they insist are as an important cultural means to protect the environment. And in doing so, they again firmly reject outsiders and state attempts to frame what they do as superstition. A third example is this Yudo Yunungombo Medical Association. This was formally established in 2001 by a learned Tibetan medical doctor and polymath, and also the dean of Dzongsar Monastery in Derge County, Sichuan. This association is focused on Tibetan medicine, including building rural clinics, cultivating medicinal plants, but also on extensive vocational training in traditional crafts and on protecting the environment. So in addition to more mundane things like trying to clean up garbage, the leader, Lodro Puntuk, negotiated a very unusual agreement with the local forestry department, in which the latter declared a sacred mountain a government protected area and gave the monastery the right to protect it, which is again very unusual in China's authoritarian political system. More than others, they emphasize principles of Tibetan medicine, in particular, the need to balance the four fundamental elements. And they make a lot of analogies between the earth and the body. So Lodro Puntuk and the other Kempos frequently teach villagers that sacred mountains are like the vital organs of a body. Thus, injuring a sacred mountain is like injuring one's brain, heart, or lungs. And these, unlike mere surface wounds, are mortal harms that can harm the entire earth, or mortal wounds. Okay, and finally, another really interesting environmentalist I met in 2019 in Amdo He's also a Tibetan doctor, and he was first inspired to take action when he noticed the declines in the growth of Tibetan medicinal plant species. He draws inspiration from Tibetan medicine, but he's adopting a different form of environmental protection. And in particular, he focuses on water as the ultimate source of life and the protection of springs, which are many of which are drying up. So together with college students and pastoralist volunteers, he and they have monitored and marked springs, including 48 that they have found have dried up. For these, they invite ritual specialists, such as this 80-year-old man who he's carrying on his back to get to the place where the spring is, and monks to the dried springs on auspicious days to chant propitiations to the Nagas or Lu. And as a result, he said they have documented 7 that have been revived. Okay, so let me turn to some commonalities between all of these different groups that I've talked about. One concept that appears repeatedly that you saw in the film and that came up in other ways in my interacting with these is this idea of the container and the contents, right? And again, this comes from an older phrase that means the world of the external container and the inner contents of the sentient beings. And again, the outer world of the container is said to be the environment and upon which the contents depend. And so, we hear this, we see this and, container and contents, and you might think that's like nature and culture. But actually, I want to suggest that, there's something more going on than that kind of Euro-American binary of nature and culture. So, for example, plants, rocks, and water are all parts of the container. Sentience is what characterizes the contents. So the contents include humans and animals, divinities, denizens of hell, hungry ghosts, like I talked about earlier today, but not plants, which are characterized by life but not sentience. Container and contents are in a relationship of dependent origination, an ontological condition in which without the existence of one, the other can't thrive or exist. So one of the sayings is the container is the result of the karma and the sonam or fortune of the contents. There's another that says the conditioning fruit ripens upon the land, right? So again, talking about the dependence between the two. So that's one commonality. Another commonality is critiques by Tibetans related to the methods of conservation that they've encountered. They argue generally that monetary incentives, such as found in integrated conservation and development schemes, or surveillance, such as found in participatory management schemes, are both ineffective and perhaps even destructive compared to the Buddhist cultivation of self. Third is the question of what should be protected and why. And here many argue that Western environmentalists only care about protecting rare and endangered species, whereas, according to some, from the Tibetan perspective, all species are equal and all deserve protecting. And they argue that the impulse to protect only certain species ultimately derives from an anthropocentric perspective, when, from their view, every sentient being wants to and has the right to live. Yet theirs is also not a radical deep ecology view that devalues human life, right? Though human life is said to be equal to those of other sentient beings, it's at the same time precious, given that the human realm is the one where conditions exist best for working to escape from samsara. Another related critique that came up in the film was the critique of protected areas. So in the film, Jado says, the Western approach designates certain places as protected and leaves others out. We Tibetans believe that all places need protection. And so such arguments form a commentary on what Bill Cronin has called the trouble with wilderness. That is this Western tendency to carve out certain areas as zones of exception for protecting, leaving the rest of the landscape as a sacrifice zone to unfettered destruction. And I want to mention one other that wasn't in the wasn't so much in the film or the examples I mentioned earlier, but there's also this idea that grassland degradation and other forms of environmental harm, including the melting of glaciers and natural disasters, revolve around the removal of substances that constitute the nutrition or the essence, the ju in Tibetan, of the land or soil, of which minerals are a primary form. So again, this word means, the contents in the container and the contents. It also means a nectar, a quintessence, and essence. As one elderly pastoralist put it, quote, minerals have been taking away the essence of the place. This has made it harder for people to survive, decreasing their fortune and hindering prosperity. According to another quote, there are very few snow mountains nowadays. People say it's because of mining everywhere. The rivers have become smaller, the sources of the springs have dried up, the marshes have dried up because the minerals have been taken. The abundant grass that was here in the past can no longer be seen. Okay, so to sum up, there are broad similarities in these interpretations of the relationship between Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture, and environmental protection. There are also noticeable differences. There isn't one single monolithic or univocal understanding of Tibetan environmentalism, but rather multiple perspectives, which usually coexist and sometimes get hashed out on public debates amongst Tibetans on social media, for example, or other public forums. Amongst the ones I discussed, for example, some emphasize not offending territorial deities because of the harm they will bring. Some emphasize not harming sacred mountains, understood as vital organs of the earth. Some argue about accumulating good fortune or karma for future rebirths. They differ in the specific understanding of balance or harmony, in the relationship between the container and contents, and they differ about their interpretation of the extent to which humans can actually evaluate and know the extent to which the environmental conditions we see in the world are the effects of accumulated collective fortune versus current efforts in this lifetime. In interpreting the problem of climate change in particular, since I know that's of interest, again, some ordinary villagers and religious figures focus on the agency of territorial deities. Others emphasize collective karma, and still others, many actually emphasize the loss of the essence or potency of the earth through mining. There's a lot of mining and a lot of protests to mining. But at the same time, all the environmentalists all really foreground the importance of maintaining Tibetan cultural vitality, arguing that if this is achieved, environmental protection will inevitably follow. And it's also important for all Tibetan environmentalists living within the constraints of the PRC to find acceptance for their Buddhist practices as something that is antithetical and not superstition. All also share varied degrees of skepticism towards Euro-American environmentalism, particularly for its answers to questions about what should be protected, why, and how. Nevertheless, they demonstrate a recognition of the productiveness of what anthropologist Anna Tsing has called the friction of collaboration, where success can be sometimes generated because of, and not just despite, divergent understandings and slippages of translation. The frequent translation of container and contents into English as ecological balance, for example, a move I've had to do in giving this talk in English when translating concepts, is grounded. These two concepts are grounded in very different views of the causative forces that explain the state of the world. On the one hand, you have a secular ecological view grounded in nutrient flows and population dynamics. On the other, you have one in which the ultimate cause of environmental conditions is the collective and individual karma accumulated over infinite lifetimes. And translating one into the other elides some very significant differences. But they also have allowed for productive collaboration, opening up spaces for Tibetan cultural assertion and improving the conditions of human health and the likelihood of the survival of other species. Unfortunately, as you saw in the film, the conjuncture that supported the opening up of space for Tibetan environmentalism to emerge and even flourish in the first decade of the 2000s has passed. So there were major protests across the Tibetan Plateau in 2008, the Olympic year in Beijing, and the crackdown on those protests really started to close down the space for the collaborations to thrive. And this is the and fall I put in the title. It's not that Tibetans have changed their minds about environmentalism, but the space for their agency has really closed by political circumstances. Since 2009, and especially in the years 2012 to 2014, there were more than 150 self-immolation protests on the Tibetan Plateau. Across China, new NGO regulations have been put in place so that international NGOs are effectively shut out and people can't take foreign money. Many legally registered Tibetan NGOs have also been shut down. Also, even before COVID, and of course it's stepped up since then, surveillance and control have been greatly stepped up. So you have these convenience police stations. You've probably read about them in Xinjiang, but they were actually kind of pioneered by the same guy in Tibet, and neighborhood grid systems. the state is paying, on the one hand, much more attention to ecological civilization, right? That's its brand in the world. It is doing a lot of very public biodiversity conservation, but really not letting or shutting down the space for grassroots groups to play a role in it, making it much more difficult. Nevertheless, despite this dramatic turn of events, Tibetans have not given up articulating environmental concerns on their own terms and acting on them, even if much more covertly than in the past, out of necessity. So of the Tibetan environmental groups that I talked about today, there are 3 that are still active. Nyingbo Yudze, the Sanjiangyuan Environmental Protection Association, though Jado himself has sort of retired from this, and the newer group on Reviving Springs. And I know of others too who are involved in like documenting their plant life as a way of showing that, again, that their work is scientific, right? And but still keeping their own ways of understanding them as well. There's also been this shift amongst Tibetans to entrepreneurialism. So between 2000 and 2010, when I met like recent graduates from college, like everyone wanted to start an NGO, right? That was the way that they saw to work on development, to work on health, to work on the environment. And that has really shifted because the NGOs have mostly been closed. And now everyone wants to be an entrepreneur, right? And so when it's easy to look at this and say, neoliberalism is taking over, it's just business. But I've done a study of entrepreneurship, and what people who are going into entrepreneurship want to do is create value, not just economic value, or not even primarily economic value, but value for their rural culture and for their homelands, right? And so they really talk not about like, if you open a business textbook, it says, entrepreneurs are obsessed with opportunities and, anyway, this is not what I found, right? They're trying to create products to make people who are still at home, the herders, the farmers, think that, yeah, we can actually stay at home, we can live, we can sell products, our products are worth something, and we can maintain our ties to the land in this way. So a couple of examples of this are, there's this person who's selling kataks made of pure wool. So kataks, the ceremonial scarf, which is ubiquitous in Tibetan culture, they're by and large manufactured of non-biodegradable substances in factories in China. And he's sort of saying, I'm going to bring back the pure wool biodegradable katak. So that's his. So it's very much environmentally concerned, and also sort of saying historically, actually, this is where they came from. There are people who are selling dri, actually, the female yak is called a dri milk soap, and lip balm and things of that kind, moisturizers, and local organic dried apples, for example. So that's kind of the thrust of entrepreneurship. Jado himself is now officially retired from his environmental organization. He's working in a social enterprise, but even so, he's still working toward the same goal of supporting pastoral communities to protect the environment and find ways to engage in social and ecologically sustainable ways of returning to the land in a different form. So he's trying to create like an eco tour or a study tour for Tibetan kids in the city who've grown up disconnected from their land to come back and learn about traditional pastoral culture. So that's his enterprise, and also trying to engage in more historically, more mobility in the grazing to try to, again, protect the environment. So, I started this project, because we always hear bad news coming out of Tibet, and I met these amazing creative people, and I wanted to tell a story of hope. And then my friends got thrown in jail, and all these terrible things happened. But I think, even despite all this, I still find people who are really creatively like finding those spaces where they can still kind of, continue working towards both environmental protection and their cultural vitality. And so I just want to end by saying we can only hope that a new conjuncture will be created soon. And once again, that again opens up more space for Tibetans in their project of cultural vitality and actions that foster the health of both humans and non-human inhabitants of the earth. Thank you. So I talked super fast so that we can have some time for questions. I'd love to take any questions or comments.
probably just say out loud. I'm so interested in your point, or about surveillance versus culture. That surveillance doesn't work. Versus we need to go back to the roots of our culture and let that lead us and guide us. That's fascinating to me, and inspiring in a lot of ways. And especially inspiring to me because I feel like Tibet is one of the most surveilled places in the world. There are cameras on every single, not just corner of the buildings, but middle of the buildings and in the temples. And it's so surveilled. And then they let the train come in, and then they promoted the two-child policy in Tibet for years when the rest of the nation wasn't able to have children. So there was it felt like when I was there that it was like a desire to completely change and surveil what was once there. So I'm just curious about, I wonder if that heavy surveillance that they experience is part of that pushback and that desire for a real reach back into their culture. I'm just curious, and how do they maintain hope that they can hang on to their culture when there is so much rapid change happening by the Chinese, right? So I leave that to you, and I loved your talk. It's fascinating.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, lots in there. I mean, okay, so one, I will say, it's very common, and I hear this, this work was done before the heavy technological surveillance that we see now comes in. But people have, experience with surveillance from the Cultural Revolution, and that's not that's not technological. That's just, kids were told to surveil their parents, and so I heard a lot, even more than two decades ago, what's in my heart is different from what I say, right? And so that is very different from certain theories of subjectivity that we have in the social sciences about action being what produces subjectivity. Like, they really want to maintain this heart, mind, and speech. So it could be, right? It could be related to that. But I also think there is a Buddhist distinction that's very long-standing of this division between speech, mind, and heart. So they're drawing on that as well. In terms of the technological surveillance, there's a great book by Darren Byler called Terror Capitalism that I think anyone who's interested in China and surveillance should read. And so, it's about Xinjiang. But one of the points he makes that I think we as Americans ought to remember is that a lot of the technology, there's a lot of American business interests in these technologies too, right? So capital is part of the story of the big technological. And you're right, there is surveillance everywhere. And I also think, there was an op-ed recently in the New York Times about the colonial boarding schools. And I do think what's happening now with this demand for kids to go to kindergarten in boarding schools away from their parents and learn only Chinese is going to be quite devastating. The Cultural Revolution was also a period of time when, a lot of language, a lot of cultural things were lost, but the technology is different now. It does make it more effective. And at the same time, you have WeChat and it's terrible in a lot of ways, and people write Tibetan on it. Right. And so I just think people for 10 years ago, and I don't know if people are still able to do this now, but there was a period of time when a lot of educated people were saying, we need to stop mixing Chinese and Tibetan. Right. And so everywhere I went, people would they would get together and there'd be a little bucket in the middle of a can in the table. And they would say, you have to put $1 in on quiet and every time someone speaks Chinese by accident, and that was something that went around. It spread really rapidly. And so I just think people are always, I think we've talked about hope a lot in different forums today. And it's well, you can't, not hoping is giving up, right? And people are resilient, or yeah, they're not going to give up easily.
So I had a question. I was really fascinated by the connection of their religious beliefs in their practice and their cultural practice for ecology. And I was wondering if what your perspectives were on religion in the rest of the world and how that could impact the ecological movement to be frankly more effective. And that's kind of my question, some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question and a very big one. I mean, I guess, in doing all this work, like I'm not a scholar of religion, and in trying to understand this, my point of departure is not to try to establish some sort of truth about what the religion says or doesn't, because every tradition is so complicated that it can say many things. And so mine was more like, how are people mobilizing their understandings to achieve certain aims? And I think a lot of that can be done. I mean, I think, across, I think I don't know that much about Christianity, but I think we can see Christianity playing very different political roles and very different environmental roles, and different, like the way it works in, in Latin America, and its alignments with politics and environmental protection have been very different from other parts of the world. So I do think, religious leaders who care about the environment, I think there's plenty in every world and other religion to find those ways of mobilizing people. I think it could be a lot more. I think even more could be done. I do think some really interesting things are happening along those lines already. There was this really interesting thing where the Karmapa, who's another very kind of high-ranking, important person, wrote an article. It wasn't a peer-reviewed article. It was like a commentary, but it got published in Conservation Biology, which is a very science with a capital S. And so that was really interesting. Like, it was a way of trying to talk to a different audience and saying, hey, religion can play a role, actually. Yeah.
I had a question about how Tibetans in Tibet see land ownership, and specifically how that impacts maybe where they go out with these organizations to revitalize the area. Is it connected to their specific locations because they think that they own the land, or is it more just that's the closest? How do they select?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, so, there's two different levels of that. Like, there are the official property rights, and they have to live by them because they are living within a certain nation state. People have been moved around historically, but like in pastoral areas, and even in a lot of villages, people are by and large still somehow connected to ancestral territories. And so there are, especially in areas where there are many mountains that are associated with particular groups of people, like Dewa, or it's Galastas tribe. It's not a good word. It's not a great fit, but anyway, like with certain tribes, right? So there are Shidak, which is the territorial deities. There's often the mountains are also often in kinship relationships with each other. And there's like small, less important ones that are for a smaller group, and a bigger, more important one that's for a larger collectivity. And so it's related to those traditional ties to the land. And there's also a lot of urbanization right now. There's a lot of resettlement, and that really breaks those ties. And I think that's a big challenge that people face. In terms of the legalities of land ownership, most rural land is collectively owned. So it's not, there are in many cases winter pastures, the use rights to which have been privatized, but the actual ownership resides in a poorly defined collective. So it's just a complicated situation. But I hope that kind of answered your
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, like, when they think about going and doing a project, is it because or I guess
People are working in their home areas.
home area?
Yeah. Sorry if I didn't.
And so they
Yeah.
don't think about, oh, this is just, do they talk about it in terms of this is home, or is it more about this is our land, or this is
Oh,
my
I see.
land? Like, in terms of like how they see, because I see the container
Yeah.
ideology, but is it connected to some sort of ownership concept? Or is the container just all of the earth?
Well, the container is all of the earth, but when people are acting, it's not, they don't say land like sa, they say yu, which is place or homeland. But it's, yeah, so it's more of a territory than a property, I would say, that's the kind of relation that they have. There was something else I was going to say, and I can't remember it right now.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that? On the, like, the poorly defined collectivity, you know, I come back to this because I'm fascinated by property machines. Are those ancestral collectivities or?
No, this is the Communist Party's doctrine of property rights. So it's a collective, but it's never clear whether that collective resides in what level of government it resides in.
Yes, definitely thought it was an interesting topic to discuss because with environmentalism, it's not talked about as much even from my perspective. Where I want to go more into Ukraine. You said a lot that one of the biggest critiques of Tibet environmentalist groups is the like our Western thought of like protecting pieces of land as opposed to the entire thing. I guess my curiosity is, do you think that these critiques are just, because when you look at the United States versus Tibet, it's like the United States is way bigger than Tibet. And, even if we try to have equal, I don't want to say surveillance, but equal protection of the land, we can't do that good job if we're trying to spread it across as opposed to just specific spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first I would say the Tibetan Plateau is pretty darn big. It's about a quarter of China's land area, and that China's land area is about the same as the US's, so it's pretty big. I think they're not coming, so this critique has been made by Americans also. So there's a very well-known environmental historian named Bill Cronin, and he says, our ideas of wilderness are totally messed up. Right? Like we think of wilderness as a place that's completely pristine and untouched by people. And so we fence it off. And then that gives us like the idea that, well, we already did that, so we can do whatever we want here. Right? So it's like protection doesn't mean we need to remove people, right? Protection means we need to, treat it with a certain kind of care and maybe not mine the heck out of things, or clear-cut logging, right? So that's, and I really see them saying that too. They're not arguing to remove themselves from the land. And now the Chinese government is doing a lot of like, well, we need to protect, so you need to leave. And like, I've worked with, or, I've been to a community group where they're like, when people leave, the wildlife leave too, right? For all sorts of reasons. The community groups used to patrol against outsiders who come to poach. When you remove them, those are gone. The wildlife also predate on some of their livestock, so they and that those people have made their peace with that, like they're okay with that, right? So there's all sorts of reasons why protection is not like no people, right? It's more saying, let's think about this idea of setting aside and, so for example, a lot of parks in the US too, they removed native peoples and then the vegetation changed, right? Because actually those landscapes had been shaped by human activity for a long time. But a particular Euro-American imaginary of what protection means actually changed the land. So.
Thank you.
We have time for about one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. Very exciting and interesting topic and so discouraging too. I was in South China in 2008, 2009, one of those two, when there was this great sort of the Han people in China, a lot of visiting of national parks, and documentaries that were celebrating national parks, and I saw one of those that was romanticizing the relationship of the Tibetan people with the wildlife. But out of that, there was also, I was working with young people, a lot of excitement about becoming a conservationist, working with wildlife. Of course, all of that sounds like shifted. One of the things I was curious about that feeds off of what the gentleman up here was saying is, when I visited some national parks in the northern part of China, not as far as Tibet, there were communities of indigenous people that were living within the national parks. Some of that seemed exploitative, like they were sort of zoo-like, the people, tourist groups came and saw the people in their native costumes and all. But I was wondering if you know anything about those relationships and what has happened since, because one of the things that was happening is that the farming was traditional practices, and so I'm curious whether that sort of thing has been reduced or shut down as well, or whether there are seeds of local environmentalism lurking in those communities as well, and whether there's anything analogous happening in Tibet where there's sort of the commercialization of the indigenous community for the tourists, or whether that's all shut down.
Yeah, lots in there. So one thing to note is that unlike the Yellowstone model, up to now, parks in China, nature reserves in China, have not kicked people out, but they're like thinking about doing it now. So, and that's because, it's so highly populated, and the history of when they came in, and so on and so forth. So that's that's one thing. I mean, yes, there's definitely a lot of cultural commodification. There's a lot of people making themselves into exotic cultural commodities to sell to tourists. And that's been going on. That happens inside parks, it happens outside parks, it happens, there's this whole one example from Tibetan areas is this town in Yunnan got a facelift, where when I first went there in the mid-90s, it was like a drab Chinese town like any others. And then it got a facelift and it became a big tourist attraction, and they put these vaguely ethnic signs on, and they put Tibetan writing, but it was often totally wrong and made no sense in Tibetan, right? And so that's kind of what you're talking about. That does happen. And it is problematic. At the same time, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say here is it's really terrible, but it's probably better than what's happening right now, which is that Xi Jinping is saying, well, forget different cultures. We all just need to be Chinese. And that's a very recent, past, the extent to which that's been really pushed hard. It's been since COVID that's been, and I think that's even more dangerous. In terms of whether there is environmentalism, I think it's a mixed bag everywhere, right? I think where there are, China has a really around big cities. There are CSAs. There are people who are invested in environmental education, who are going out and working with rural people. Other places have a very different scenario. So it's quite varied. But yeah, it's a complex country with lots of different things going on.
So I have a few more things before we thank Emily one more time. I want to thank the people who made our spaces possible for us as we come out of COVID and start being in spaces together. It's really useful to remember how much conference and events management and the folks who put all the chairs and make all the technology work, dining services for practicing their plant-forward provisions, and Marson, our facilities services and custodial services. They have restored, you will see the full range of waste diversion possibilities. So your plateware can be composted and your cups to be recycled. And tremendous gratitude. This has just been so delightful and also troubling, but in productive ways. So we're really grateful for you to share your work. And for those who would like to continue the conversation, tomorrow from noon to 1 in the GLC gallery, will be our last chance to have sweets, conversation, and the last part of our visit with Professor Yan. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions.